I do need to get some stuff out here. Just a minute to get organized. Just a minute to get organized here, as you can see. All right. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to take this thing off. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to be here, and especially Frank Kiker, whom I've known for a number of years. He's also a Davidson alumnus, though he graduated considerably before I got there. But then I didn't come as a student, you see. Let's see. It's an honor to be here and to share this very special day with you. In fact, I feel somewhat sheepish about being here, in part because so many of you are veterans, and 2 or 3 of you are veterans of the conflict that we're talking about, which makes us all sort of stand and say, wow, we're glad you're here. Before I go, excuse me, my voice is not cooperating fully today. I'd like to pass around and sort of jump it up here a few items from that era, from the other side, and from perhaps the ugliest part of the other side. These are mementos from, most especially, the SS. There's an armband here of the regiment called Der Führer. There are insignias. And then if you can juggle it around here, you'll find a belt buckle that says, my honor is loyalty. That's the German honor is loyalty. There's one here that says, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one empire, or one state, and one leader. And you all have to be together. So let me, if you don't mind, pass this around. You can look at it as it comes, just to kind of show and tell, as it were. Now, when Frank asked me to talk today, I said, he said it was D-Day, of course. I said, right. I said, but I don't really want to talk about D-Day. I said, I know that most people there will know probably more about it than I do. Some might have been there, but I'm sure a number of you are buffs in a way, and indeed I am not. Let me warn you, I'm not a military historian. I'm what I call a generalist. I know that all of you have read books about it, including perhaps D-Day by Stephen Ambrose. This is a very iconic photograph of the event on June 6th. It's in today's newspaper, if you've seen the Charlotte Observer. I think page 2, so you might want to look at that. You've no doubt read or surely seen the movie based on the book, The Longest Day, by Cornelius Ryan. Here's another iconic photograph. This one shows the empty landing craft with the poor devils, pardon my language, at Omaha Beach, going to sacrificial assault early on. Here is a photograph, I don't know if you can see it or not, of that, or a landing craft before it goes down and before it's open and the men leave. It's just that you've seen it, no doubt, the men waiting to be dropped ashore. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with book. This, by the way, is a very excellent book, A World at Arms, A Global History of World War II by Gerhard Weinberg, who has been at Chapel Hill for a number of years, now retired. You've seen, no doubt, Saving Private Ryan, which is a very graphic picture. And perhaps you've seen some of the television programs of late, that, especially last week, that described the organization for D-Day and the landings. And did you see the one about the effort to survey the ocean floor off the beaches of Normandy? No. Marvelous undertaking to catalog every wreck and identify it. If you haven't seen it, I hope you get a chance to do so. Anyway, I will try to remember as I go forward. I'll tell you about my topic in just a moment. I will try to remember that you are not degree candidates. You are not preparing for exams. and you don't want to be here a whole class hour. I'll try to keep that in mind as I go forward. I would also, before I go further, like to call to your attention a note that I got yesterday, or the day before, email, from a friend of mine who teaches at the Moscow State Institute for International Relations. He's an historian. He's been at Davidson a number of times. I've been with him and others in Moscow. He started his academic career writing about U.S. history. He wrote a book about the Democratic Party. He has shifted his ground and has become an historian of the Cold War and other aspects of the build-up to that. And he recently took part in a multinational conference in England about 1944. There's just a survey of many, many papers about 1944. And he wrote a paper about the correspondence between Churchill and Stalin during World War II. A fascinating paper. I wish I could throw my remarks aside, perhaps, and read his paper to you. I won't. But in the cover note, he said this: "Let me add that there were only 2 Russian participants and only 1 panel on the Eastern Front, which says something about different perspectives and memories." So I would urge you to keep, and I'll make some reference to that as we go on. But he's got a good point. If you're going to have an international conference about 1940, not about D-Day, but about 1944, you need coverage of what's going on our second front, that is, the other side of it. So please keep that in mind. Now, what I want to talk about today for the next few minutes is the second front, or the issue of the second front. I hope most of you know what I'm talking about. Of course, D-Day was the centerpiece of what we know as the second front. So it fits, I think, as I told Frank, I think we'll be in the ballpark, even if we're not on the base path that most of us are paying attention to today. The second front was an issue from the get-go, of course. I guess the question is, when was the get-go? The issue of the second front certainly predates U.S. entry into the war, and in a sense it also predates the German invasion of Germany, of the Soviet Union, in June of 1941. I want to remind you, and I hope this is a refresher course, but that, what I'm talking about, but that you will not find it too familiar, so that, you say, oh, yes, some of this. But, of course, the French and the British had no second front between 1939 and 1940, when France surrendered. The British had no second front between the surrender of France in June of 1940 and the July 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. So for Great Britain, in a sense, we stood alone, as you should recall, for that year, fighting much of the time in North Africa, first against Italian troops when Italy entered the war in June of 1940, and then, of course, against German troops under Rommel. So for Britain, the second front began when? It began when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. And of course, Churchill was overjoyed at this. I should add further that Churchill will sort of be the centerpiece of my remarks today, and I hope you can understand as we go along why. But he was overjoyed. He said something to the effect that if Hitler invaded hell, he would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. So he was greatly relieved to have that huge second front. Now, Or from the other side, the Soviet Union said, we need, Soviet leaders, Stalin especially, we need a second front. Churchill was always very quick to point out, where was our second front when we stood alone? At the same time, Stalin kept needling him about the British reluctance to fight. Of course, Britain did not stand altogether alone in 1940-41. I just remind you in passing, that the United States did supply over those months an increasing and varying amount of supplies and help to the British before we got pulled into the war. The issue of the Second Front became particularly acute once the United States did enter the war, late in 1941. And the main theme I want to convey today is that the issue of the Second Front, that is, when to open a major operation against German forces in Western Europe, was a major issue for the next 2 years or so, 2.5 years. And it was an issue rather more between the Anglo-American allies than it was between the Western allies and the Soviet Union. However much the Soviet Union kept pressing for a second front. The U.S. administration, of course, wanted to hit the Germans as hard as they could, as soon as they could. As you know, the Roosevelt administration decided early on that it would try to put the emphasis first on Europe. Roosevelt deemed, wanted most of all, of course, to save Great Britain, because there was a question of whether Great Britain could hold out, much less whether the Soviet Union could hold out. And the Americans needed Britain, if nothing else, as a big floating base, aircraft carrier to get into Europe if they were to get there. So they wanted to keep England afloat, and of course to keep the Soviet Union from going under or from making a separate peace with the Germans. And besides, the administration in Washington thought that in the near term at least, the Germans posed a far greater threat to this country than did Japanese expansion in Asia. Not all Americans saw it that way. I mean, Americans were very angry against the Japanese, at the Japanese. They wanted to hit the Japanese with everything we had, and let Europe take care of itself. But Roosevelt decided we need, and it was always a problem for Americans as well, as you know. So the question was, all right, if we put the emphasis on Europe, when and how and where are we going to hit the Germans? I should point out that before it was all over, there were several second fronts going on. Roosevelt made the unwise step, perhaps unwise, early in the spring of 1942, telling the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov that the U.S. would open the second front against Germany before that year was over. Now, fortunately, his own advisors and the British qualified that enough that there was some sort of out when that didn't happen. But Stalin, of course, took that as a firm commitment, and of course tried to make everybody in the West feel guilty about it. For his part, Churchill argued that a peripheral approach was the only one that was sensible and possible, including a Mediterranean-centered strategy. He argued from early on that the Western Allies needed to invade northwestern Africa and then concentrate on clearing the Mediterranean. The Americans, led by Chief of Staff Marshall, General Marshall, wanted to build up to hit Western France, to hit Western Europe. And so that became the major issue, off and on, for over the next several years. I might add that the Russians and their repeated appeals for help. Now they got help. They got Lend-Lease help too. A growing flow of supplies from this country and from England to boost their war effort. Raw materials, vehicles, food, helmets, you name it. I understand that the Russians at one point late in the war came to call trucks just by the generic name Studebaker. That's so I've read. Anyway, Stalin and his advisors never seemed to grasp the significance of that tank ditch called the English Channel, much less of the Atlantic Ocean full of German U-boats. And so that was something that stood in the way of understanding on that side. Early on, however, the British planners decided that they had to jolly their American allies in some fashion, even though they knew that they could not launch a cross-channel invasion anytime soon. And they didn't want to. And that's one of the things I'll talk about in just a moment. They didn't want to. But they agreed to a series of projects, at least in theory they agreed to it, to build up forces in England for a cross-channel invasion, beginning early. It's called Bolero. And then round up, that is plans to make a cross-channel invasion in 1943. And then another variation on the theme called Sledgehammer, a plan to, a scheme, the opportunity presented itself to hit France sooner than that. That is late in 1942. Were the Germans about to give way, and that was not likely, or were the Soviet Union clearly to be on the verge of collapse? But throughout the year, Churchill kept harping on the plan to attack North Africa, and also to attack the northern Norway. Why northern Norway? Because that's one of the course for convoys getting to the Soviet Union with supplies went around that North Cape, and the Germans control Norway. They control the whole the western coast of Europe, except for Iberia, and both Spain and Portugal were neutral. Anyway, he wanted, Churchill did, to reduce the threat, the destruction from German forces in northern Norway. Stalin thought that might be a sensible thing to do. Most British advisors and American advisors said, no, can't do it, not worth it, sideshow. Weinberg thinks it probably would have been a good idea. Historians differ on these things, you know. That's one thing you should be warned about. Anything I say today, you can find somebody else to say, look at it another way. Now, what factors did argue against a cross-channel invasion in 1942, or even perhaps in 1943? Well, obviously the U-boat threat, which was horrendous. Obviously the lack yet of adequate shipping, both to get men and supplies across the Atlantic and landing craft to get men ashore. Obviously the need for a larger U.S. Army. In 1942, the United States didn't have much of an army yet, and they had to build an army, had to train an army. And Churchill himself was get-go said, it'll take 2 years to build and train an army that can take on the Wehrmacht. And then, of course, they did not yet control the airspace over Western France. That gradually occurred late 42, early in 43, in part because of the strategic bombing over Germany, which did hurt and forced the Germans to pull their airplanes back to try to defend their home space. But it was not until 1943 that they had sort of turned the Battle of the Atlantic. There were still submarines, but that they could get mass shipping across. And so there were practical reasons why they did not why they could not launch an invasion, whatever the Americans, or whatever George Marshall wanted. Now, I would also like for a moment to look at Churchill's reasons for Churchill's reluctance to sanction a cross-channel invasion and to concentrate on the Mediterranean. One was empire. He wanted to protect the British Empire and certainly the passage to India. The Mediterranean was very important for that. But even more important, it seems to me, was Gallipoli. Does that ring a bell to anybody? Gallipoli, an operation in World War I, 1915, when British forces, primarily Australian and New Zealanders, went ashore in Gallipoli, that is at the Bosporus, Turkey. He said Churchill had helped push that operation, an amphibious operation. It was going to knock Turkey out of the war and open a way to help Russia in World War I. And it was a disaster. You know, they never got off the beaches, really. They were there, troops were there for a number of weeks. They got mauled, they had to be pulled off. That stuck in Churchill's mind. Even more than that, perhaps, the Battle of the Somme and the battles in Flanders in World War I. And Churchill spent some time with the forces in France, but man, it reminds you that the first day of the Battle of the Somme, is that S-O-M-M-E? It was a middle of summer, obviously. July the 1st has been seared into the British social memory. Because on that day, after massive bombardments that they thought would knock the German defenders senseless, masses of British troops went over the top, across no man's land, and were mowed down by machine. The Germans had just gone deeper in their trenches, came up, were ready with those machine guns. The British suffered on one day 59,000 casualties, about 19,000 of whom were dead. Churchill's physician told General Marshall during these arguments about when to do what. Churchill's physician told General Marshall at one point, "You are arguing against, or you are dealing with, the ghosts of the Somme." Churchill himself said to General McCloy, who visited him in May 1944, when it was clear that D-Day was going to happen, or that the invasion was going to be launched. Churchill said, "My generation lies dead at the Somme in Passchendaele," is another battle in Flanders. Churchill did not want to see a repeat of that kind of slaughter or of the disaster at Gallipoli. Of course, he also remembered Dunkirk when they got pushed off. And then there was another factor. He kept hoping that Germany, under the impact of massive strategic bombing, would collapse without a major invasion. That is, with massive strategic bombing and with losses to the Russians at the east, that Germany would go under before the kind of invasion that Marshall wanted could take place. It's not so much that the British did not want to go ahead, but that they hoped that it would not be necessary, or that when it occurred, it would be kind of a mopping up operation, a coup de grace. The Americans never could fully understand that the British were thinking of operations in the Atlantic as as the best way to get at German forces without risking the kind of slaughter that he remembered from World War I, or the failure at Gallipoli. They never could understand that the British were still thinking in part in terms of both and. It seemed to them that the British always tried to find a way to delay or wiggle out of commitment to, or setting a firm date for the attack against Western Europe. And Marshall wanted to push on with it. Indeed, I'm going to skip some things here, but point out that in 42, this is fairly early yet, when it seemed as if they would not agree on an attack as soon as Marshall wanted, General Marshall said, we just ought to go to the Pacific first. Let's leave them fighting a defensive war if they want to over there, and we'll go hit the Pacific. And Roosevelt called his bluff. Have you worked out plans for the kind of operation you're talking about in the Pacific? No. He says, I had promised that there will be fighting at least against German forces in 42. We're going to go with Torch, with the operation against North Africa. And then, of course, as Marshall knew, that deferred everything. He sensed that if you go into North Africa, it's not going to be wrapped up quickly. And it wasn't. Then, of course, once you conquered North Africa, and it was a successful operation after a number of initial setbacks. Then, of course, what do you do next? Well, it was too dangerous to pull the troops. Some people said to pull the troops and ships back to England, still, middle of 43. Troops are in North Africa. It's time to hit Sicily, and if Sicily goes quickly, then we can hit, this is the British, then we can hit Italy and knock Italy out of the war. Italy was an ally of Germany. And so that's what the Americans reluctantly agreed to do. And so you had the campaign there, which again deferred operations later. But those operations did give time to build up supplies, to manufacture landing ships, gave troops experience in battle, gave messages about how to undertake an amphibious assault, and did, I think, contribute to the eventual success of D-Day on the 6th of June, 1944. I will say a couple more things quickly, and that is that the landings in North Africa, late in 42, did lead Churchill and Roosevelt to issue the demand for unconditional surrender. It's a term you no doubt are familiar with. This they issued in January 1943. It was both designed to reassure the Soviet Union, we're not fighting in France yet, but we're not going to quit until Germany surrenders unconditionally. Stay in. It was also a warning to the Germans. You're not going to be able this time to do what you did last time and say you weren't defeated, that your armies were stabbed in the back. We're going to go all the way and we're going to beat you. Whether it's through Italy and maybe the Balkans, or whether it's through France, we're going to beat you. Churchill also decided about that time that as a sop to the Americans, who were having to go now into the Mediterranean, that they should set up a planning process for an eventual attack against Western Europe. And that step proved to be very important. It is the organized planning for a cross-channel invasion whenever it would be scheduled to take place. And this is a new book that I recommend to you. It's about that planning. It's called Neptune, the Allied Invasion of Europe and the D-Day Landings. Neptune was the code name given to the site of those preparations that was naval. And became, it's an integral part of the operation, obviously. This massive arrangement for that cross-channel invasion. As you know, the largest combined air, sea, and land operation in military history. Still is. There's a lot, let me simply say, there was a lot of argument back and forth still before they settled ultimately on a date. The first date was May 1, 1944. It's hard to describe how, we may have the sense that the Americans and the British fought, that they were sort of hand in glove, that they were a great coordinated team. They argued vehemently for years. But in the end, of course, they did come together for that event that we celebrate today. Now, in closing, let me just say, I would like to say, I think Churchill in some ways was right early on, but Marshall was right too. They needed to hit hard the Germans in France. And I'd like to say, what if they had not hit? But, they had continued to defer. What would the Russian army have done? By 1944, Stalin was telling his commanders, I hope they invade, but if they don't, we can beat Hitler on our own. And what if the Russians had defeated Germany in Europe? In Europe, that is north of the Alps, north of the Balkan Mountains, on their own. In Churchill's defense again, let me say that he didn't say we won't attack, but he wanted it to come at a time when he thought the chances of success would be greater, when the losses would be smaller. When they could get what they went to get without so much blood, toil, sweat, and tears. But that would have meant no D-Day.
If anybody has any. If not, thank you so much.
I have one.
Yeah.
Since your area of expertise was the Soviet Union and all of the things that happened after the war, do you think Churchill was right when he wanted to take the Balkans?
It would have been nice if they could have taken the Balkans. I'm not sure that was more important than Western Europe or getting into Germany. I mean, it's very important that the Western forces got as far into Germany as they did. It seems to me that you needed to meet the Russians as far east as possible. Besides, getting over the Balkans would have been very hard. And if you look at a map of the topography of Europe, the Alps north of Italy, the Balkan Mountains, they're almost impenetrable. So, yeah, that was very important. Another question? I would have one to show. Yeah.
Excuse me, what was the title of the first book you mentioned about D-Day?
Well, the first book I mentioned about D-Day was the one by Stephen Ambrose.
Well, there's another one.
Well, The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan. And then I mentioned this whole, it's a history of the entire war, and it's a very good book.
The World at Arms.
The World at Arms, A Global History of World War II. It's an excellent book. I would show you one thing here. I know you've got to go. Anybody wants to ask me about the legend of the Africa Corps liquor, I'd be glad to tell you.
Okay.
This is it's a wine bottle, right? I mean, this came from the two second fronts in North Africa and Italy. I mean, those were second fronts, clearly, before the big second front at Normandy. All right, it's a wine bottle. But it says, this is a replica of the original, extra special old, finely matured old Scotch whiskey. I helped drink the contents. The Brits sent casks of whiskey, rum, etc. to troops in North Africa. Rommel captured this stuff. How much disappeared then, who knows? But he shipped the casks back to Italy as ballast, and ships going back and forth supplying him. The Americans captured the casks when they got to Italy. And the Americans decided they would have this stuff bottled. They commissioned an Italian winery to bottle it. And then the American Army and the American Air Force got into an argument about who owned it. And they couldn't settle the argument. So they shipped the stuff north of the Alps into Austria in bottles and paid the Austrians who knows how much money to store the stuff in salt mines near Salzburg. Finally, in the mid-19, who knows how much disappeared in the problem. In the mid-1970s, the Army and the Air Force decided they would split it. Sensible, right? Solomonic decision. Sensible. A brother-in-law of mine who was a career Army, stationed in Germany, bought several of these things at the PX. When I visited in January 1977, he gave me a bottle. 2 years later, when he and others of us were together at the beach in North Carolina, we drank it. Wonderful stuff.
All right, one thing we would like you to do, there you go.